I mean, even in just the 5 years since I first started working on Mildew in earnest, I've seen the perspectives on secondhand change so much. Learning the stories behind things can help people to cherish them a little bit longer, starting to learn about the icky side of the mainstream fashion industry and, the exploitation of people and the planet. I think we also started to get tired of not feeling represented by what we see in scenes. It's really fun and exciting to have that aspiration be old shit.
Hey guys, welcome to the first chapter of TRNZK Conversations. After a lifelong career in fashion, I decided about 8 years ago that it was time to question not only how I shopped, but also how I worked. I wanted my clothing and career to align with my ever-changing values, and that is how I started TRNZK. These conversations now go deeper into creativity, culture, craft, whilst also keeping systems change, ethics, and sustainability at the forefront. Guests have been incredibly generous with their time, and I found these conversations extremely enriching, and I hope you do too. So let's get started. Today's guest is Ellen Freeman, editor and founder of Mildew Magazine, a magazine dedicated to purely secondhand clothing. In this chat, we talk about celebrating not buying new, the joy of dressing, and maker culture around the world. If you're listening rather than watching, I highly recommend tuning into the YouTube video because Ellen shares a lot of the visuals from the magazine. We also talk about an exhibition that Ellen is a part of, and I've shared those links in the show notes. The audio cuts out right at the end, so you can find Mildew Magazine on Instagram and Substack, and please jump online to purchase a copy for yourself at mildewmag.com. Let's get into the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining me, though.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Alan, for anyone who's not familiar with Mildew, how would you describe the magazine in your own words?
So Mildew is a print magazine about secondhand fashion. So it's kind of like anything that you would expect to find in a traditional fashion magazine, except nothing is new. Everything is secondhand, recycled, vintage, upcycled, antique, all the many parts of the secondhand spectrum.
And that's actually what I find really interesting because obviously fashion cycles and fashion media is so built traditionally around newness. And so how, as an editor of a magazine, does that impact the way you create Mildew?
Yeah. And I think with that, a lot of people think that if you wear vintage fashion, you're going to look like you're stepping out of a period piece. But the idea with Mildew is kind of mixing and matching old things in a way that feels new or presenting them in a way that feels new. So I'm definitely still, just as excited about fashion trends as anyone else, or as anyone else who's into fashion. But I think that it's just trying to show that you don't have to buy a bunch of new things in order to look stylish.
You've a long career in independent media as a journalist and working under the Broccoli magazine publishing banner, which is actually how I discovered Mildew myself.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So how has that experience and now becoming an official publication under Broccoli supported you as an editor?
Yeah. I mean, I started working with Broccoli when it first launched. So it was right before I came to Mexico. So about 9 years ago. And that was my first experience in print. I'd been writing for the internet for a long time. And so I was really used to thinking about ideas through the lens of clicks and timeliness and relevancy and that engagement. And so working in print gave me a new way to think about telling stories that was much slower, much more evergreen. I think you could pick up any of Broccoli's publications, even 10 years after it's over. And if you don't look at the date, you wouldn't realize that it's old. And we actually there's no date on the cover of Mildew because I think people sometimes encounter them years later. And I think it's still, going to feel fresh, hopefully, fresh and exciting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I had a few years working with Broccoli on the magazine that we started with, which was about cannabis culture, specifically for women and through a kind of artistic, natural lens. Um, and we started kind of branching out and working on other magazines, and that showed me that for example, we made a magazine about mushrooms of all kinds, from the kind that grow in your garden to the psychedelic kind. Well, I guess those can be the same thing.
I actually have a copy on my coffee table of
Oh,
the mushroom people.
I'm so glad. Thanks.
I love it. Yeah.
Um, and that kind of showed me like you can make a magazine about anything. Like as long as there's a community of people who are excited about it, magazines don't have to be about selling things, which is kind of how I had seen print magazines before. So that made me feel like, okay, I could make a magazine about secondhand, even though it's not trying to sell you anything. Although I do feel like Mildew is not trying to sell people on the idea of secondhand fashion, but trying to show people how fun and exciting and stylish vintage and secondhand can be.
Well, I think that's what's so fascinating about new media is that you can sell these ideas as opposed to selling product.
Yeah, and I mean, fashion magazines and magazines in general have always been aspirational. There's always
Yeah.
like a lifestyle, and it's really fun and exciting to have that aspiration be old shit.
Working with so many different people as you've done over the last 4 issues, what are some of the most exciting things or most memorable experiences you've had in the secondhand world?
Yeah, I mean, besides the stories that we've told in the magazines, every time we've launched an issue and then sometimes in between, we've hosted a clothing swap, which has been so fun. So we've done a few in Mexico City where I live. We did one in the middle of a street fair in Brixton in London when the designer of Mildew, Corbin, was living there. We've done one in Portland, one in LA. I think that's all of them. But it's so fun because it like reminds me why I love secondhand, because there's a mix of people who are coming with like full bags, cleaning out their closets, dumping things on the tables, because it's a free for all. Anyone can come. You can take anything you want. It's not like a one-to-one trade. It's just take whatever you want and we donate everything at the end. And then there are people who have never done that before and are like, what do you mean it's free? But I have to give you something, but I can't just take it. And I always find cool things at all of the clothing swaps too.
I really wanted to acknowledge that obviously with secondhand culture, there's so many beautiful stories secondhand, and there's some really romantic ideas that come through. But obviously, we also know that the global south is inundated with clothing and product, and that's a real reality of secondhand culture in today's society. So, how does that impact you, and what sort of thinking around that with the magazine, or even from a personal perspective? I mean, in Mexico City, there's known to be huge markets like that.
Totally. Yeah. There's so much secondhand here. And a lot of it is coming straight from the border with the US. So it's the things that have like completely moved through the pipeline in the US, gone through the Goodwill, the Salvation Army, haven't sold there, and then get sold by the bales here.
Mm.
Yeah, that is a huge issue. And I think that there's a way of thinking about thrifting that I see on the internet that is kind of replicating the big hauls of the fast fashion consumerism too. Just like buying a bunch of stuff, moving through things really quickly, which, if you're a huge shopper and you're buying a bunch of things all the time, it's better that you're buying them at the thrift store and they're staying in the circulation a little bit longer than if, you're buying a bunch of fast fashion things. But I think that it's not just like a free pass to consume more just because it's secondhand. And so we try to tell stories that also talk about fabric quality and how things that are a lot of new things today, the thread count is actually like too low for them to stay in circulation for very long. And so you also need to know how to mend and darn your clothes if you're going to keep them going for longer, how to care for your clothes, proper ways to dispose of them. And I love talking to people who are doing totally different things like composting with t-shirts, or I was just speaking with someone who's working as a writer for this nonprofit that is all about trying to build up the textile industry in the US. So working with sheep ranchers and cotton growers and mills, and trying to build it back from the bottom so that better materials are going back into the garment industry. So I'm kind of trying to look at it from all different ways. But we've also been to some of those markets in the issues where, the big bales coming from the Western world are arriving in other places. In our first issue, we had a story from a flea market in Nigeria that was really fun.
Oh, beautiful.
And so just seeing
And
kind
this
of
is the thing, there's a lot of maker culture coming out of these communities too, isn't there?
Yeah, totally. A lot of really cool designers doing things with the stuff that's ending up at the very end. But there's, learning the stories behind things can help people to cherish them a little bit longer. Find another way to wear them, even if it's been in their closet for a long time, just so that things are staying out of the ocean for as long as.
When you think about sustainability in fashion media, it's been a word that's thrown around a lot for the last, 10, 15 years, but it also is a word that's really dying. Nobody really likes the word sustainability. It's kind of overwhelming for a lot of consumers. So I'm just wondering, if we switched out the word sustainability and thought about reuse culture, what are some specific impacts that conscious shoppers could take out from Mildew Magazine that you've learned?
That's such a good question. And you're right. I feel like brands aren't even talking about themselves as being sustainable anymore because of all of the greenwashing that's happening. So no one believes them anyways. However, Lane, which was supposed to be the sustainable, company, was just sold to Shein and everything. But
I think we're all reeling from that.
yeah, let me think about some reuse stories that we've told over the issues. In issue 3, this writer, Gabby Wilson, did this really cool story about Filipino reuse culture.
Beautiful.
And she talked about how growing up in a Filipino household, there were always indoor clothes and outdoor clothes. And eventually your outdoor clothes would get used enough, or you would, grow up and they would stop fitting you, that they would then become indoor clothes. And then they would graduate from being indoor clothes to being rags and reused in different ways. And so she talked to some artists and designers who are reusing textiles, traditional Filipino way. Really cool. Yeah, I loved that story. We talked to a historian about the history of mending, and she took us all the way back to this textile from King Tut's tomb that had been mended, and just talked about how people have been mending and flipping and taking apart clothing for as long as it has existed. And that used to be a much bigger part of a garment's life. Was, you could literally take apart a dress, flip the fabric inside out as it had become faded and stained, and make a whole new dress out of it. And how really before the advent of industrial knitting machines, people spent so much time every night knitting their socks, because as we know, socks just wear out so fast, and you couldn't just go out and buy a new ready-made pair of socks. And yeah, those are some stories that come to mind.
I think that's what I love about talking about this, is because it was only a few generations ago that sustainability was a necessity. It was just actually a way of life because of the way we had to function. And so we've just gotten really far from that now.
It's really true.
It actually arrived last night at 3
I'm so
p.m.
glad you have a copy of the 4th issue, because I don't. I have one.
You don't? Okay, well,
I'm
I do.
Why don't I have it? I gave it away to
think so.
yeah, it's got a long way to go.
So I wondered, I was really taken by your editor's letter where you talked about where you'd heard some teens, I think maybe on TikTok, and talking about greenwashing and absolute experts, right? And that's what I find when I'm doing street interviews at fashion events, is that young people really understand a lot of what's happening. But
Yeah.
then you put that next to the contradiction of working with a department store owner, perhaps. And I just really wondered if you'd share that story from your perspective, for the listeners.
Yeah.
And just thinking about the contradictions that important media like Mildew still have to play as a role in society.
Yeah, I mean, even in just the 5 years since I first started working on Mildew in earnest, I've seen the perspectives on secondhand change so much. When I first started telling people about the idea, it was like, but how could you make a magazine about that? You know, there's nothing to sell. And now I think we've seen this explosion of resellers on Instagram, of people on Substack who are talking about shopping, but only talking about vintage shopping, of all of the e-commerce platforms like Depop, Vinted, Poshmark, The Real. I mean, it's just endless. There's so many. And it's become so much more accessible and easy and frictionless and normalized, that I can start to think like, oh, well, do we still need a secondhand fashion magazine, or is this just normal now? Is this just how people shop? And I think for a lot of people, it is just how people shop, and that's really cool. But then I forget that there's still this kind of attachment to ideas about like cleanliness and newness in the fashion industry. And so that story from the editor's letter of issue 4, I was talking to the owner of this department store in the US in the South that I was so excited about featuring. And because they're kind of, I haven't been there, but I'd seen it on the internet and it looked like a time capsule. Like they still have a bunch of dead stock items with tags on, and it just a store from another time. And I really wanted to feature them, and we'd set up a photographer and someone to do the interview. And then I told them the name of the magazine. And the owner, who was an older guy, was like, well, we can't be associated with a magazine called Mildew because people, they might think that our product has mildew. Mildew is a problem. It's something that you want to get rid of. And so no one will want to read that. And I was like, well, we've already done 3 issues and thousands of people disagree with you. And, and the whole idea is, reclaiming this thing that seems gross and saying like, look how beautiful it is, look how original it is, in kind of a tongue-in-cheek, lighthearted look. And and he said, well, talk to your publisher, and if they'll change the name of the magazine to Vintage Americana, then we'll do it. I was like, no, I don't think that's going to happen, but thank you so much. But yeah, it just really showed me that there's still room, I think, for people, especially people who grew up having no other choice but to shop at thrift stores or to shop secondhand, and who felt, who were made to feel shame about that. There's still some stigma attached, I think. But I think that now that the stigma around secondhand is definitely much less, and I'm seeing like celebrities wearing vintage on the red carpet, I think there's still room for education around second. Where I see that now is in the friction of secondhand shopping. I think that we've all gotten really used to the ease of seeing something, wanting it, buying it, having it, and secondhand doesn't always work that way. I recently bought some, well, I had what I thought was a secondhand success story and might turn into a tragedy, but it might still be saved. I'm not sure yet. I, like a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, was staying with my partner's aunt and needed to borrow a pair of shoes from her because to a nice restaurant and I didn't have anything nice to wear. So I borrowed this pair of shoes from her, and they were these really cute 90s platform Mary Janes, and I loved them and they were so comfy. And when I got home to Mexico, I was still thinking about them. And so I asked her, like, could you take a picture of the brand and the size? And I'm going to do a little alert on eBay. And I looked on eBay and there weren't any in my size in a color that I liked that seemed like good condition. And so I just kind of slept on it. And then eventually I like went back to look and there was a pair in my size that was like looked like it was in really good condition. There was only $10 but if I was going to order them to Mexico, they would have been like $80. So I sent
Yes.
I sent them to a friend's house in the US. And then 2 months later, that friend visited and brought them down. And I was so excited. And I wore them once and they completely fell apart. They're totally trashed. And I took them to a cobbler and we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We'll see if they're able
Fingers crossed.
to glue those heels back on. But I just thought, like this is not the experience of seeing the trendy pair of pants, the must-have pants for the summer, and one click ordering them and they show up 2 days later. Like sometimes with secondhand, you have to really, really search. And if those shoes come back from the cobbler and I'm able to wear them for even 6 months, like that's going to be so amazing.
Yeah, it's because now you've given them a whole new life in Mexico City,
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and those two together, so shifting culture, shifting ideas, especially perhaps of a different generation based on the department store. What is your experience growing up with secondhand? Was it acceptable growing up for you to shop secondhand? Was it the thing to do?
It wasn't the thing to do. We were definitely all shopping at the mall when I was growing up. Or in catalogs that would come to the house and I would circle the things that I wanted and then kind of like present it to my mom and hope that I could convince her to buy me them. But where I first got exposed to secondhand was through Halloween costumes. And I was always really into making my own Halloween costume with the help of my dear mother who had to put up with a lot. But I remember one year my friends and I were going as the cast of Alice in Wonderland and I was the Mad Hatter. So I needed a hat and a blazer, and a tie and all kinds of things that I didn't have. And we went to Goodwill and it was just like, wow, there's everything. Like anything you could want is here and it's so much cheaper than going to the Gap or wherever I was shopping then. And it made me really excited about being able to like customize this costume. And I didn't start like actually shopping for myself there until later, probably in high school. But that was also that was another aspect that was exciting about it is that for my mom, it seemed so much cheaper than the other things that I wanted that she was willing to buy me anything if it was secondhand. And she would be like, oh, just throw it in the cart, $6 for a pair of pants. Yeah, throw it in the cart. And that was very exciting for me as a teen.
Now just moving into media's role in shaping identity. So when I first came across Mildew, it was around about 6 to 9 months ago with issue 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really taken back by the portrait on the front cover. Exactly. And showing a more mature aged woman looking so creatively put together. And I really just love the idea of, yeah, this is it. It's so stunning. I love it.
I love the story too.
And I just really love the idea and the important role that media plays in the way we see ourselves. And I'm wondering, as an editor, what kind of responsibility you see in that?
Yeah. Well, I think right around the same time that we were all kind of starting to learn about the icky side of the mainstream fashion industry and, the exploitation of people and the planet, I think we also started to get tired of not feeling represented by what we see in magazines because, the typical model that we see in a magazine is really thin, tends to be white, is wearing clothes that we'll never be able to afford. And that just stopped feeling inspiring, I think, definitely to me, but I think to a lot of people. And so when I started making Mildew, I knew that it wouldn't make sense to just be replicating that and just be putting clothes on skinny white models, expensive clothes on skinny white models. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to include a lot of different bodies, a lot of different age groups, things that feel affordable and accessible. And my mom, who has had gray hair her whole life, I mean, not her whole life, but since her 20s, as I also do, was like,
Mine's hiding under the rug.
she was like, please, please, please use a model who has gray hair. And the story didn't happen for a few issues, but then in the pitch call for issue 3, this stylist, Rebecca Diaz, who I'd been kind of chatting with on Instagram because I loved all of her vintage styling, pitched us an idea that was kind of loosely Grey Gardens inspired. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Grey Gardens, but there's Little Edie and Big Edie, and they're older women with just incredibly eccentric style. Yeah, the headscarf.
I always think of the headscarf.
So she pitched this story with her friend's mom, Linda, as the model, who has always been kind of involved in fashion. She was I think she was a pattern maker, and she had a boutique in LA that was like a baby boutique. And she'd always wanted to model, but she'd never had the chance. And they pitched this story using Rebecca's personal collection of vintage. And it seemed like they just had the most fun dressing up.
It's really beautiful.
It's so
and
beautiful.
I think there's such a joy around.
Yeah, I mean, her smile is so joyful. I don't know how you could not feel beautiful in these outfits. And it's been so cool to see the response to these too.
Stunning.
Because people have been really excited about this editorial.
And I think that's what actually, just on a personal reflection, that's what excites me still about fashion, despite all the negative things that, we see in this industry that I've worked in for 20 years, is that it can really, you can see the joy in somebody when they're wearing something that they love. And that's what I think is beautiful about Mildew. You can often see that in the pictures that you share.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we're definitely guided by joy and beauty. There's a side of fashion that, is very cool and visually appealing, and I love too, but it's the like cooler than you. And that's not really Mildew's vibe.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just was wondering, so we're kind of getting towards the end, and something I've really loved asking people is more of a personal reflection. So outside of work, where we're dealing with things like operation and a lot of creative stuff, I'm really excited to hear what is creatively inspiring people right now outside of work.
Yeah. So I have I have a club with my friends. That is called El Sindicato de Miniaturistas, which in Spanish means the Miniaturist Syndicate. And we all just somehow one day realized that we love miniatures, and we started sending each other little miniature things that we would see. And Mexico has a huge miniatures culture for some reason. Like if you go to the folklore museum here, it's filled with little miniatures. I think it might come partly from the Day of the Dead celebrations, where you're making an altar because it's easier to fill it with miniature versions of things rather than the full size version. But I'm not sure if that's
incredible
part of the history. But anyways, so then it kind of started becoming more and more a real thing, and we put together an exhibition of miniature art, and we just applied for a grant to do another exhibition, and we find out in 3 days whether we got it or not. So we're going to do it regardless. But so that's been really fun, just to kind of hold the magnifying glass up to my eye and see all of the fun things that are happening in the world of tiny objects.
Amazing. You'll have to share details so I can put them in the show notes. That sounds really exciting.
Yeah.